Okay, and 5, 4, 3.
Good morning. Here we are again with another episode of Springboard Your Biz TV. I'm excited about today because we've actually been waiting to do today's show for quite some time now, and we had a few things come up, but we were still able to secure our guest today. So I'm very honored and pleased to introduce you to John McKeever. He's the CRO of Endeavor Management, and he's also an expert in overall customer experience and patient experience. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what 2020 did and how it made it more difficult to manage the overall experience, and a little bit about what to do about it. So John, thank you for joining me today. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Evan. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. Where are you today? I know you
I'm
like
in
to
Houston.
travel a lot. Where are you at?
I'm in Houston. Yeah, we've had the luxury over the past year of being able to take a series of road trips in our car, and I'll share some of that experience with you during our time today. But got to see how different states are actually handling the pandemic and the regulations and everything else, and really how people and consumers are dealing with it too.
Yeah, when we started out this show at the beginning of the year in January, we started talking about how to break out of the craposphere, because there was so much, new use of LinkedIn and Zoom and other ways to, basically bombard people with sales and marketing messages using, social media, because people were, locked up and they couldn't go out, or, the office was shut down and there was only a few skeleton people there, and it just kind of made the whole, approach to going out and trying to win business that much more difficult. And what I tried to do is bring in some of the companies that were already operating at a high level before the pandemic hit, and try to take some of those best practices and help people experience those. And that's what we were doing to help people kind of break through the craposphere. What were some of the things that you saw that really impacted, the customer experience?
Yeah, so I think, from our perspective, first as a leader in our professional services firm, we definitely saw that there was a high degree of uptick in terms of people making connections with us via LinkedIn and through other resources. There was a scramble in terms of how are we going to get our message out. That we were certainly part of that as well. But what we saw is there was a high level of interest among leaders, particularly those who are responsible for customer experience management, to understand what they and others are thinking about what's going on. So, this turmoil and what we call an involuntary transformation really catapulted organizations who serve customers, which everybody does. It catapulted them into an entirely new normal. And so the implications of that is still kind of being sorted out. But definitely, as we look at exemplars and brands that have done an exceptional job in terms of pivoting during the pandemic and embracing the new normal, there's a lot of challenges out there for sure. And certainly we saw some of that leading up into the pandemic, this whole notion of consumerism, and then we saw it accelerate rapidly throughout 2020.
Yeah, one of the things that I saw people scramble with the most, who, had been doing some marketing and weren't really prepared. And like I said, we call it forced process improvement with what happened. But a lot of it was around brand reputation or reputation management. I think a lot of people didn't even have that component on their radar as far as something to really pay attention to, especially on a B2B side. And it kind of ramped that up pretty quickly. Did you notice that as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in addition to being thrust into this digital world, and for a lot of the industries we work in, some of them were less mature than others. So we do a lot of work in the energy industry as well as in healthcare. And so coming into 2020, they may have had lots of discussions about how to deliver an experience in a virtual space, but they had actually never done that. So there was a mad dash to figure out, okay, what is this now? What does this mean? And then now a lot of the work that we're doing is helping organizations try to figure out, okay, so now you've done that, you're here, you've developed this digital experience. Now, what do you what do you keep? What do you prioritize? How do you prioritize all the pieces? Because unfortunately, the unintended consequence of this involuntary transformation is that we've probably given consumers way more or too many ways to interact with us as organizations. Thinking about all the different social media channels, thinking about email, chats, virtual dialogue, and even how that works is all new territory for a number of industries. And so trying to sort through those channels as well as sorting through who it really matters most is part of what we'll talk about today.
Perfect. So, for us, some of the overall, examples that we used, I think were, definitely Uber was one of them that I would talk with people about. My wife actually started using something called Stitch Fix because you couldn't go in and try on clothes anymore, and Stitch Fix was really cool because, you put in some measurements, they sent you some clothes, and you had a stylist, and, they really kind of combined the whole online to, being able to have an experience that also became personalized to some degree. And, I think those were two companies that did pretty good. What were some other companies that you saw that did a good job during that time?
Yeah, well, you mentioned Uber, and on our slide here, one of the personal experiences I had was with Disney. So I'm a proud grandfather of 6, and every year we take some portion of our large family to Disney World. And so during the pandemic, of course, Disney had a brand to protect. So what I found interesting about what they did is they embraced virtual, and they really accelerated the type of things they were doing online in terms of entertainment. And at the end of the day, Disney is an entertainment brand.
Yeah.
But then also in terms of the opening, it was one of the brands that I trusted in terms of getting everything right. So there's a lot on the line for Disney World to actually have opened in Florida, and we were actually one of the first guests there once everything reopened. And as I suspected, they managed the experience from beginning to end, I would say flawlessly. They provided a really great example of how to give consumers trust, give them a high level of confidence that infection rates and everything would be properly sanitized, from having reservations online in advance to demonstrate that there was a cap on capacity. So I think in the first round that we went there, we've been there twice since the pandemic. The first time we went there, it may have been 25% in terms of admissions. And so, and they also gave you a window, so you could only be there in the morning or in the afternoon. And that gave our family quite a high level of trust. But even in terms of, as we talk about the omni-channel experience, every single touch point, even within the park, was an indicator of that quality and safety. In particular, you can buy a memory maker, which is they have these photographers that go around. But a couple of key things that they did there at Disney World is that they would not take your picture if you take your mask off, which was at first frustrating. And then I kind of thought, well, you know what, this is a good indicator of safety and quality. And then the second thing is there were no characters. And so that's kind of a downer for the kids. But when you think about it, those characters in those big stuffy, suits are probably the biggest germ carriers that a Disney World attraction could possibly have. So they were all very smart, wiped down everything after every series of riders went through, made our family feel really safe. And of course, as it relates to the customer experience, then of course, I tell this story and advocate for Disney and say, hey, you know what, if there's a brand that did it right, it was Disney. You mentioned Uber, and there's a couple others on here that are really good exemplars, particularly as it relates to thoughtful experience management. Amazon. One of the key things and key touch points that Amazon has that most may not actually recognize until you are at home were the drivers. And so even though they do a lot of outsourcing, one of the things I found particularly helpful with respect to Amazon is that Amazon drivers actually have fun. We had many drivers who would, always had a smile on their face, would leave the packages, ring the, ring doorbell, do whatever. And some of them had music blaring and dancing and all those kinds of things. And the brand gave them permission to have fun. And that was important because some of those Amazon drivers were the only people we saw. We were working from home, working from anywhere. And so we had a high, they were kind of our connection to the outside in some respect.
Yeah, and I think, one of the reasons that I think Amazon did such a good job with their drivers, and I don't know if this is true for all of the drivers per se, but I remember when there was actually a time when Amazon said, hey, we're going to give you the opportunity to go out and start your own business, and basically you're going to run a Amazon delivery service. So they took employees out, they displaced them, and then basically gave them a loan to start their own delivery business.
Yeah, and that's amazing. I mean, I really applaud Amazon for so much of the work that they do. And, even though, and it's actually quite interesting to me when I hear it, that, they're fundamentally a data business. They really aren't the, consumer goods. In fact, even Amazon Web Services, they figured out a way to, database and, develop algorithms and models and all kinds of other stuff. And now they license that to other businesses. And that's where they make most of their money, apparently.
That's amazing.
So putting the customer at the center of all that and really, profiting from their core competence is pretty amazing.
Well, I know that, you mentioned that there was all of these things that people were forced to change and do. And, you mentioned how hard that is. Why do you think it's so hard for people to understand? I know it's because it's new territory, number one, but, when you start thinking about the experience and the journey, why do you think it's so hard for people to, adapt quickly to that? What made it difficult for them to adopt?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing was the speed. So it was an involuntary transformation, meaning that all of a sudden we are thrust into this kind of work from anywhere. You're socially distant. You've got kind of the safety concerns of just running your business and understanding that. But always it has been the case that the customer experience is very complicated. And normally there's not a champion for it at a high enough level in the organization. And so everybody, actually, no matter where you are, plays some role in satisfying the needs of customers. But normally how organizations treat those things are in a very siloed way. So one of the key ideas here is first and foremost to look at the experience as being holistic. Healthcare has actually come a long way in this respect, and there's great resources available from folks like the Barrel Institute. But basically, the idea of a holistic experience means that it begins and ends. It's holistic in that it's all the touch points in which they're interacting with you, as well as resources that you may not even own. And so as you can see in this particular slide, awareness generation, these may not even be things that you have direct control over. So like word of mouth recommendations or things like that, what's posted on social media. That actually is part of the customer experience. And then on the tail end too, and this is often the overlooked piece, is having had an experience with you, what actions do you want your customers to take? And so this is, again, somewhat new territory. Some industries do a much better job of this than others. But it's, how do you create an experience so exceptional that customers go out of their way to recommend you? And so recommendations used to be just, hey, if someone asked you about, hospital X or, company Y, you say they're good or bad. Now it's advocacy in terms of, I'm going to take time out of my day and post something about my experience. One of the cool things about that, though, is what we've uncovered is that most of the reviews and most of that advocacy comes from meeting or not meeting an emotional need. So there's a lot of conversation, a lot of work that we do around human-centered design. And for us, we translate that into not just the customer having, functional needs and needing an efficient process, but actually how that customer feels about the interactions that they have with you. And I think in last week's show, you talked about culture. And really, from our perspective, it's the culture from an organization's perspective that that establishes the expected behaviors for your teams. And those behaviors, when delivered consistently, satisfy emotional needs of your customers.
Yeah, we
The other
definitely hit
thing,
home on that, on the emotional side of things as being the most important differentiator, right? Because the functional side is almost a must-have.
right, right. Yeah, you don't see a lot of people going out and bragging about how fast their meal was delivered. They may complain about how slow it was, but
Right.
often the richness in the stories that you tell is about how even the wait staff did something very special for your dad's birthday. And they brought out a cake, they just listened and they did it, and you didn't have to ask. Those are emotional needs. They actually aren't functional. It's not about how fast they brought out the cake with candles. It's about how you felt about it.
Yeah, there's another good example my wife likes to use. Whenever we are out eating and we're being served by a great waiter, one of the things that a good waiter or waitress will do will anticipate your needs prior to you having to ask, right? I mean, if you're getting a plate full of Buffalo Wild Wings, you kind of know that one napkin is not going to be enough. So you appreciate when somebody has some forethought to give you a stack of napkins. But that type of, anticipating it really does strike a chord emotionally and improve the overall experience.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I mean, experiences are designed and then delivered. If you're doing things accidentally, then it's not a well-designed, it's not orchestrated. And actually, if you bring up the slide that I was showing too, one of the challenges that organizations face is that they're so focused in their silo, they may not even see the forest from the trees. And so one of the things that we recommend doing is to map out the experience, and even in a more detailed way, look at the differences amongst the segments. And so this is, again, part of the challenge that organizations have now is there's so many different options. There's so many different ways. We call it omni-channel in that, there are these variety of components that we've now given to consumers. And so how do we properly organize them? And not that we're going to turn off certain pieces, but we actually, to be effective in orchestrating and designing that experience, we actually have to prioritize them. So one of the ways to do that is through personas. And so identifying key market segments based on psychographics and behaviors and attitudes, and then mapping it by those personas. And so when you're able to do that, then you actually have a map that can be very prescriptive in terms of the various steps that need to be taken.
Yeah, and so talk a little bit about that. How do you define the persona? Do you do it by the way they go about the journey or by the identifying factors of the buyer? Because I know that can be confusing for people.
The best practice is to do it based on the customer as who they are. One of the interesting things that I didn't mention about consumerism, and it applies to these segments, is that it's no longer the case that your customers are comparing you to your competitors only. What they're doing is they're comparing you to folks like Uber and Amazon and Netflix and saying, well, if they can do this, why can't you? And so understanding from their perspective, from the customer's perspective, where they are coming from, the variety of life experiences that they have, their experience with you and your competitors is important as well. But actually their fundamental psychology around how they buy and how they purchase may transcend the particular service you're offering. So an example in healthcare would be that someone who is a cancer patient really is in a stressful situation, but that just brings out more of the personality traits that they apply in everyday circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so understanding that, psychographically from, as a person, this is how they make decisions. And so now we're just applying that through the lens of making a very, series of very serious decisions around cancer care.
Yeah, even from the subconscious level, the negative drivers of their behavior even become stronger is typically what we say under stress. So it makes it even that much more sensitive when you're in healthcare.
Right. And so, and then one of the other key pieces too is that from a healthcare perspective, and this applies to actually all businesses. If you substitute healthcare and the experience map, we've got a disconnect usually between those who are promoting services, kind of on the marketing or sales side,
Right.
and then those who are actually delivering. And so bridging that gap is another useful way of using this experience map. So this is an example in healthcare that's being shown here, but you can see that unless you have a connection across those pieces, you run the risk of having marketing and sales creating a promise that operations can't deliver on, and vice versa. Operations probably has a much better sense of who your customers are, what they're about, what their emotional needs are. And so bridging that gap across is really important towards driving advocacy. And that's one of the things that we very much promote with our clients, is putting cross-functional teams together to design the experience. Having that connection across those different functional areas has been really important.
Yeah, I think that is so key. I mean, I see that regularly, and it doesn't matter what industry you're in, where you'll have salespeople or marketing people who have, done a lot of different events and work to kind of warm people up to give you a shot. And then you're given that shot, you have the new customer come in, and from an operations standpoint, things aren't quite what they were promised, and you really don't get that shot again, right? And then you have sales and marketing who are trying to justify, well, this is what I did, this is what worked, you want more business, but are you able to actually keep that business? And when you get that business in the door, is the experience enough to where they're going to create some advocacy when they leave, right? And it's like those two elements have been at odds with each other, from a sales and marketing standpoint to a sales and operations standpoint, all those different silos over the years, to where, we had a process called sales culture engineering that would try to bring those together. Now you hear things like sales enablement, but I think, customer experience and getting those cross-functional teams is really the only one that breaks down all of those silos to focus on the customer.
Yeah, and the simplest definition of omnichannel is putting customers at the center of all the things that you do. And so, even in developing personas and getting these insights built, whether it's through research of customers or just putting the customer in the room, putting customer proxies in the room, it's just helpful to have that different perspective, because if we're stuck in our silos, we will solve the problem of today and be very short-sighted as it relates to connecting all those pieces between, promises made and promises kept. And furthermore, to the point that you made earlier, one of the other biggest missed opportunities is who controls the customer relationship once they're done with the sequence. So this advocacy, who's responsible for that? And usually no one is. And so, we're missing opportunities as business leaders to stay connected with those customers for a longer period of time, giving them the tools they need to actually advocate on our behalf, whether that's in repeat purchases or even recommendations, or giving you feedback for innovation. One of the things that we did last year, we made a couple of key acquisitions, and one of them was acquiring an online gaming marketing company. So this company was responsible for launching a number of really high-profile online games. What was fascinating about that experience, even in terms of that acquisition, is how exciting our clients were about it, because online gaming is really good about building community, is really good about building brand champions, enthusiasts, people who will put tattoos on their arms, put stickers on their computers, all that kind of stuff. And then also
Pay
really
for
good
clothes inside the game. I mean,
all kinds of money spent, but also, I guess the most important piece to me is that they are really good at cultivating innovation out of their community. And so, these are the other missed opportunities. Without a clear definition of what the customer experience needs to look like, a person on the operational side may miss an opportunity to essentially share up the ideas, innovative ideas that could have actually made or satisfied a key emotional need, because they had no place to go. now, going through and thinking through things as an through an omni-channel lens, there's an opportunity for everyone to participate in that innovation. And the source of that innovation is usually those customers.
Absolutely. And I know that that's a lot of the work that Endeavor Management does and that you do personally. So when is a good time for somebody to start thinking about engaging with somebody like Endeavor Management to kind of help them, either, obviously we had force change last year, but this year it's kind of more of a continuation of, we got to continue to do this anyway. When's a good time for somebody to talk to you or engage with you?
Yeah, well, it's usually as soon as there is a strategic imperative that's outlined. And so the burning platform, no acknowledgement that you're in a current state and have to transform into some future state. So a lot of the work that we do with our clients is helping them to envision what that future state would look like. And we use customer research. We have expert advisors who serve as customer proxies to help envision what that future state would look like. And our biggest value is helping organizations to progress. As I mentioned before, often there's a temptation to focus on the daily business. We call that the run the business agenda. Changing the business takes a different agenda, and it requires a higher level of commitment from senior leaders. It's dangerous because you're changing the status quo. There's a lot of risk associated with it as well. And so we try to help organizations through insights and experience to spend less time in that danger zone of uncertainty, because one of the worst things that can be done, and I think was reinforced last year, is that if you establish a new future state and you don't arrive there, then confidence in the organization and leadership starts to erode. And so how can you as a leader make sure that you establish that vision but also execute against it, is part of what we help do.
Yeah, I love the excuse, I'll say, when I'm talking to leaders about growing, the excuses, but we don't have time. We're so busy, right? It's that busyness objection. And that's exactly what there's a run the business agenda, and then there's a change the business agenda. Some people don't change, so I'll say, well, let's call it the grow the business agenda, right? Because you're one of the two. Strategic imperative or that initiative, just by assigning those different people, that's how you find the time, right? And then you can see where you find more time, and that's how the organization actually begins to transform. Obviously working with somebody like Endeavor Management and yourself, you kind of skip through a lot of the learning curves along the way, and you go straight to somebody who's facilitating that working. And I think that's like the biggest aha or conversation that I end up having with potential clients is they're busy.
Yeah, and
Right?
it's about priorities. If strategy is about choosing what not to do, that also relates to the time that we spend on certain things. And sometimes what also makes it hard with envisioning that future state and the transformation is, just like you said, people don't like change. And so how can we characterize things in such a way that energizes the organization to where they don't feel like they're actually making the change? And so oftentimes the best transformational strategies are those that people didn't realize actually happened.
Yeah, I've also heard that you're doing a good job as a management consultant if you walk in and people go, what is it that you do anyway? That's what I've heard. I don't know. So, there's obviously, some things that you've learned, right, going through the past year, and obviously you were experts in this prior to the pandemic, but what are some of the things that you've learned that, leaders can start to do to help move their company forward in improving the overall customer experience, even when times are crazy?
Yeah, so the big thing is remembering that the customer matters, putting the customer first, and aligning and prioritizing any type of initiative around that customer. And you can define customers in a variety of different ways, but even with manufacturing teams, I've gone into workshops where they're like, I don't know why we're here at customer experience, we never interact with customers. And my question to them is, who pays your paycheck? Well, an ABC company does. It's like, no, they don't. They write the check, but the person who puts the funds in the bank, that's your customer. And so, aligning around the customer and putting customer in the middle is important. The other big thing is creating empathy. So as we talked about before, understanding the emotional needs of those customers, regardless of whether you're in a B2B environment with engineers, they have emotional needs too.
Yeah.
Physicians have emotional needs. As surprising as that may sound, it's about feeling mutual respect and making sure that you're a partner with them, all those types of things. So creating empathy is really important, and one of the key tools to use in that would be developing personas and actually creating visualizations and words and even language to put that customer in the room with you. I would say the other thing too is really energizing teams around this goal. And so this is actually where some of the change the business and run the business pieces overlap. And so often there are initiatives that you would have already undertaken. Let's say they're working with Springboard around deploying a new CRM or a new sales training program. If we use that toward the end of achieving some future state and kind of link those two pieces up, you're achieving both goals at once. One of the recommendations I would have that I mentioned before would be that when you're building those teams in terms of workshopping and designing solutions, include cross-functional representation. So always have, kind of the front end marketing sales folks, as well as the operational, those who are delivering together. And actually that interaction usually yields some of the best outcomes and best ideas than anything any management consulting could come up with. And then finally, as a leader, keeping your eyes on that long-term vision is really important, because I know myself as a leader within our firm, it's very easy to get consumed by day-to-day, this needs to happen, that needs to happen. And when I talk with leaders, particularly those who are in customer experience or marketing, and they're focused on growth themselves, growth is not about what revenue is coming in today. Growth is about the revenue that's coming in 6 months, a year from now. And so as a leader, we've got to keep our eyes on the vision of where the puck is headed and meet it there, as opposed to the day-to-day routines, which again, it's easy to tackle day-to-day stuff really. And you have to dedicate the time, kind of like what we talked about in terms of that, change the business or grow the business agenda, and literally have separate meetings, separate calls where that is the only agenda. And furthermore, in some of these transformations that we've done, setting up a team whose responsibilities may be exclusive to the transformation. And sometimes that's called a project management office, and we try to characterize that as much more of a transformation office.
I know sometimes too you kind of help organize some of the issues that rise into other categories. I think for healthcare you use care, coordination, and communication. When you're working outside, what do you call those?
Yeah, so actually there's 3 key lenses that we look at, one of which is brand. So that is where marketing plays a key role. Sales and marketing teams are often setting the promise of the brand, but understanding what those expectations are from the consumer or the customer is really important. And then we look at operations. So operations is about the processes and technologies that you use to deliver the experience. And these are typically meeting more of the functional needs. And then, the culture. So these are the expected behaviors, the standards that are set usually internally around the things that the teams will always do, always say, always think about, etc. And so those are the 3 different areas. And essentially what we're trying to do is to get organizations to develop and design an experience, in this case, that sets the proper expectation, that delivers consistently to meet both functional and emotional needs, that will create advocacy. And as we've talked, having that word of mouth is so important, and being able to capture that and represent that even in a B2B environment is so critical, because it's much more authentic to say what a customer thinks about you than what you think about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you can see why I was so excited to have John with Endeavor Management on the show. He's definitely somebody that we go to and we look for advice and leadership and thought leadership from, and I appreciate you taking the time to be on the show today. John, how can people get in touch with you and Endeavor Management?
Well, they can reach me on LinkedIn, John McKeever, and they can also shoot me an email, jmckeever@endeavormanagement.com, and our website address is Endeavor Management, and the management is mgmt.com.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for joining me here today, John. You look great. It was great talking with you, and I hope you have the great rest of the week. For those of you tuning in to Springboard Your Biz TV, thank you so much. We appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to tell your friends to go to YouTube, look up Springboard Your Biz TV, and subscribe. That way you'll be notified each time we go live. And then also you can go to springboardyourbiz.com, where we will have different leadership topics available for you in the community to join at no cost. So thank you again for tuning in, and have a great week. Okay, we're clear.